Hello, welcome to the Maison Française of New York University. My name is Phillip John Usher. This is the 10th episode of our series, Conversations with People Who Read Montaigne. Thank you for joining us today. And today, my guest is John O'Brien. John is Emeritus Professor of French at the University of Durham in the United Kingdom. He has held positions at various institutions and received countless awards and distinctions for his work on the French and Greek and Latin literature of the Renaissance. John has written on many topics, including a book about the Renaissance reception of the Greek lyric poet Anacreon Redivivus from 1995. But today he joins us for a discussion of Montaigne as one of Montaigne's very best readers. John has written much about Montaigne, much more than I can hope to present here. But despite my best efforts and all the things that I will have to be leaving out, today's introduction will not be the shortest, so please buckle your seatbelts. In the next few minutes, I will discuss just some of the ways in which John's work has shaped and should shape our reading of the essay. To begin, to orient us as first reading recommendations for anyone not familiar with John's work, I offer a few words about some of what I think of as his statement pieces about Montaigne, pieces that enlighten both experienced and new readers of our author. To Ulrich Langer's Cambridge Companion to Montaigne in 2005, John contributed a chapter, Montaigne in Antiquity, Fancies and Grotesques, which introduces us to Montaigne's thinking about antiquity, a relationship that is anything but antiquarian, and which John studies in three distinct domains, namely the essayist's use of quotation, his connection to classical philosophy, and the question of models of behavior. Emphasizing Montaigne's mobile tastes, for he has no fixed preferences, John walks us through many chapters and contexts, such as Montaigne's upturning of classical aesthetics in the way that, in 128, de l'amitié, of friendship, he quotes Horace's mention of a fish's tail stuck to a beautiful woman's body as model, not anti-model. His dialogue with Virgil and Lucretius in 3-5, Sur des vers de Virgile, on some lines from Virgil. His complex relationship with classical philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, and of course Sextus Empiricus, and various classical models for action and living, especially Epaminondas, Cato the Younger, and Socrates. John concludes, in the way that Montaigne relates to classical antiquity, Montaigne creates the seemingly unlikely conditions for the emergence of the essay, redefining as he does so classical antiquity as both a rich legacy and a problematic inheritance. 10 years later, in 2015, John contributed The Humanist Tradition of Montaigne to Philippe Desans' Oxford Handbook of Montaigne. Taking up the precise and useful definition of humanism that we owe to Paul Christeller and Nicholas Mann, i.e. humanism not as some supposed revival of interest in humankind, but related to Italian humanista and Latin studia humanitatis, as a commitment to classical literature and the importance of education. John shows us just how much, in the domains of education, theology, law, and medicine, Montaigne is in dialogue with contemporary humanists and their intellectual pursuits. The essays would not, John demonstrates, be what they are without the intertextual and at times interpersonal connections between their author and the likes of George Buchanan, Marc-Antoine Muret, Denis Lombin, Adrien Tourneb, Jacques Amiot, Pierre Bunel, Cornelius Agrippa of Nettesheim, Henri Etienne II, and many others. John's 10-page entry on Montaigne in Michael Moriarty and Jeremy Jennings' Cambridge History of French Thought, published in 2019, titled simply Montaigne, is another fabulous standalone reflection on Montaigne as a thinker. Beginning with a discussion of the essayist's antagonistic relationship with scholastic Aristotelianism, he calls Aristotle the prince of dogmatists, Montaigne that is not John, but there remains in the essay a substratum of residual Aristotelian thinking. John explores some of the ways in which Montaigne thinks with and against various other thinkers of various schools and traditions, with an emphasis on his particular employment of Pyrrhonian skepticism and the range of application he finds for it, leading up to a discussion of the essay as genre, which allows for, quote, a flexible and shifting pattern of engagement with what tests or tries out the human. John's pithy conclusion to that piece, a diamond nugget that should be included on the dust jacket of every edition of the essay to prevent misuse, is as follows. The emphasis throughout is on production, not on a finished product. With its sinuous, open-ended multiplicity and shifting horizons, it seems, accordingly, more useful to speak of Montaigne's thinking than of his thought. Also essential for anyone opening the essay as a student or scholar is John's short, crisp, scholarly, and spirited piece published in French Studies in 2004 titled, Are We Reading What Montaigne Wrote? In just 5 pages, John explains in clear and nonpartisan language just what we're reading when we pick up different editions of the essay, and indeed what we're reading can be startlingly different based on our choices. John discusses the various ways in which modern editors have debated whether editions should draw on EB, the Exemplaire de Bordeaux, i.e. Montaigne's hand-annotated copy of the 1588 edition now kept at the Bibliothèque Municipale de Bordeaux, or on the 1595 edition prepared by his fille d'alliance Marie de Gournay, which, as scholars generally agree upon, was based upon another now lost copy of the essay bearing Montaigne's additions and alterations. A debate that culminated in a head-to-head between André Tournant and Jean Séart in print and in public discussion at the Bibliothèque Nationale. Rather than taking sides, John, in what is a genuine joy in scholarship, concludes that one thing is clear. The story of Montaigne's essay has become more polymorphous, challenging, and intricate than we knew it was. One of the staggering things that I note now in 2024 is just how difficult it is to procure many of the now out-of-print editions. For example, Tournant's brilliant and controversial 3-volume edition for the Imprimerie Nationale that gave rise to such debates. Following on from these statement pieces, I next note that John has taught us a lot about the early reception of the essay, especially within the UK and in continental Europe. One piece, a 2013 article in the journal Renaissance Studies, sheds new light on the reception of Montaigne in 17th century England via a discussion of 3 of Montaigne's readers, namely Sir Ralph Banks of Kingston Lacy in Dorset, Sir William Cornwallis the Younger, and John Locke. Despite all the very good work about the English reception of Montaigne, much of it focuses on his reception via Florio's translation, whereas, as John shows, Montaigne also circulated in England in French. John looks at Sir Ralph's account of the essay handwritten on the rear flyleaf of his copy of the 1657 folio edition, in which he calls Montaigne a man of a profound judgment and quick apprehension, a great humorist and much wedded to his own ways and fancies, adding too that his language is very apt and significant, and for the time he wrote, elegant. John shows that Sir Ralph is more than just a casual reader, that he read him in French, and that there is no overlap between Florio's views about Montaigne and those of Ralph Banks, whose assessment of Montaigne is independent. A really useful counterbalance to the narrative that has Florio as being he through whom access to Montaigne is granted in England, which is only part of the story. A second piece, a 2016 chapter for the volume Montaigne in Transit, takes up the impact that Montaigne's work had on the German jurist and 7-times rector of the University of Tübingen, Christophe Bezold, who quotes the essay over 100 times, always in French, although his writings are in Latin, and who refers to their author as Magnus Montanus, the great Montaigne, Gallorum Socrates, the French Socrates, and the philosophical phoenix of our age, titles whose pertinence John shows via a careful analysis of Montaigne's influence on Bezold. Montaigne is not just a favorite author. Seen as a Socratic inquirer, Montaigne's impact is felt in the interlocking domains of theology and politics. As John sums things up, in the same way that Socrates offered Montaigne a philosophical persona, so now the French essayist performs the same function for Bezold. A chapter from 2021 with the title Self Before the Self, the evidence of early readers of the essay, including in the Global Montaigne volume prepared en l'honneur de Philippe John, pursues John's interest in anonymous or unknown readers of Montaigne, whose pen marks, which, as Timothy Chesters has put it, allow us to trace patterns of attention, offer an important means for decentralizing the story of early readings of the essay. Beginning with a handwritten comment made in a copy of the 1593 Lagrange edition of the essay, now at Cambridge, a comment inscribed next to the opening lines of 218 du Démentir on giving the lie, that reads simply "écrire de soi," writing of oneself. John shows how the word soi, unlike moi, develops a lexical and conceptual range without tying it automatically into questions of consciousness, the singular I, or a moi that has a conceptual history within a philosophical tradition of which Montaigne might be the precursor. In other words, building off this marginal annotation, John warns us about making Montaigne our ideal ancestor and encourages us to see soi as an object in a world of objects. What is important about soi is that it's recognized by Montaigne's contemporaries, whereas moi comes to full prominence only at a later stage of reading the essay. The chapter, which I encourage you to read in full, makes a convincing argument for how a historical reading based on annotations can open up a different dimension of Montaigne's activity, and for how we can discover a network of connections different from those we assume if we start with an a priori concept of where and how we will find concepts such as self, in turn helping us to avoid the twin pitfalls of antiquarianism and presentism. A 2022 volume that John edited for the Bulletin de la Société Internationale des Amis de Montaigne might also be placed under the general rubric of reception, although in a different sense. Titled Montaigne Outre-Manche, Montaigne Across the Channel, i.e. in the UK, the volume gathers together a dozen or so chapters by many of the smartest contemporary readers of Montaigne in the UK, such as Warren Butcher, Neil Kenny, Terence Cave, Raphael Garrod, our guest from the previous episode, Vittoria Falanca, and many others. The volume shows the richness and diversity of Montaigne studies in the UK. Un paysage autre se profile et se laisse découvrir dans ces pages, says John in his introduction. A different landscape appears and allows itself to be discovered in these pages. Jonathan Patterson talks about the social and economic situation of Montaigne the gentleman. Neil Kenny talks about race. Valérie Westilianou looks at Montaigne's connections with the Protestant doctor Louis de Serres. John himself offers a chapter about Montaigne and La Boétie. But it will be impossible to summarize properly the volume here. As John notes, tout concourt à camper le portrait d'un Montaigne prismatique, d'une fouillante proie impossible à contourner à un seul penchant intellectuel. All leads towards a portrait of a prismatic Montaigne, of a fleeing prey that cannot be caged inside any one intellectual sway. The volume's value, no doubt, lies in the fact that it cannot be neatly summarized, for what it offers is truly a snapshot of Montaigne in the UK in the early 2020s. John's work on Montaigne is, as you're gathering, extensive, and there are many other pieces that shed new light on the essay and their author. I encourage you to check on John's list of publications that will be online at montaigne.us. For the sake of time, I will thus not tell you in detail about his articles on Montaigne's dietary habits, on his use of illness metaphors for the wars of religion compared to those of Duplessis-Mornay, on his art of slowness, on Des Cannibales, on cannibals, nor on any of the other topics on which John has written. But I will tell you about two more areas of inquiry that are central to John's work. John is also interested in Martin Guerre, whose famous story, his life was taken over by the impostor Arnaud Dutil, Montaigne takes up in 311 Des Boiteux on the Lame. In 2011, John published an article that is essential reading for anyone attempting to teach that particular legal case, or indeed for anyone wanting to get some perspective on what exactly we are to do with the 1982 film version by Daniel Vigne. Reviewing and comparing the 16th century accounts of the case written by the trial judge Jean de Corras and by the author Étienne Pasquier in his Les Recherches de la France, John draws our attention to several key points. He notes especially how Pasquier's account singles out how, in the trial, Martin's anger at his wife is taken as the key proof of identity, how Pasquier's conclusion, strikingly different from Jean de Corras, emphasizes Martin's responsibility. After all, he abandoned his wife. Is he not the guilty party here? John then turns to the film, singling out several key scenes, especially the one which is not based on any historical document, in which Martin's wife admits that she was party to the imposture. Martin had neglected me, she says, and walked out on me. Arnaud treated me with respect, like a real husband. The film, John shows, plays an elegant trick on the viewer, creating the expectation that its climax will coincide with Arnaud's confession, whereas it is female desire that brings things to a satisfying narrative end. The question of authenticity in the film and in history writing is thus not simply one of limiting oneself to historical documents, but of sensitivity to the silences of the historical record, of subtle reflections on the notion of verisimilitude. John is also preparing a book on Martin Guerre, tentatively titled La chaleur de la narration, le cas Martin Guerre entre histoire et récit, un épisode de la première modernité française, which will be submitted to Classique Garnier, and to which I'm greatly looking forward. A final domain in which John has done a lot of thinking concerns Montaigne's late friend Étienne de la Boétie, and he has in fact been prolific in this area. He has written articles on numerous related topics, La Boétie and Xenophon, political friendship, the image of anti-nature in La Boétie and his contemporaries, La Boétie's library, Robert Beale as a collector and reader of La Boétie, sovereign power and freedom related to La Servitude Volontaire, about a Latin poem by La Boétie, an unknown manuscript of that same work, La Servitude Volontaire, that is, Latin translations thereof, and much more, including on whether we can read La Boétie as an absolutist. Two volumes in particular deserve their place on the shelves of anyone interested in La Boétie and or Montaigne, namely, firstly, a volume realized alongside Marc Schachter, titled La première circulation de la servitude volontaire en France et au-delà, published by Champion in 2019. The volume, obviously about the circulation of La Boétie's study of tyranny, presents and builds on the recent discovery of unknown manuscripts of La Boétie's text in various libraries, which collectively cause us to shake off our reliance on the manuscript that was found in the library of Montaigne's contemporary, Henri de Même, now known as manuscript Fond Français 839. The volume thus offers us 8 texts of the Discours, 5 manuscripts and 3 that were published in the 1570s. In his conclusion to the volume, John emphasized just how rapid and just how extensive the circulation of La Servitude Volontaire was throughout Europe, including in translation and including via the already mentioned Robert Beale, a British diplomat who, with text in hand, returned to England and who delivered the death sentence to Mary Stuart, whom he considered a tyrant. Secondly, and hot off the presses just this month, is John's book De manuscrits en bibliothèque, actualité historique et mouvement chez la Boétie, published by Classique Garnier. It is a rich study indeed, organized as a series of studies rather than as a monograph in order to offer a prismatic view of la Boétie. Each part unfolds, decline a different aspect of la Boétie or of his treaty, and it has had to do this to recognize the extreme suppleness of La Servitude Volontaire, a text that recreates itself at each new iteration, and of which each new activation is also a renewing, une réactualisation. The various chapters read together convincingly show how we are dealing with a text that only exists by the utilization that is made of it, and an author who is in possession, dépositaire, of the intention and sense of his work. The book only just came out, and I admit that I am still making my way through it, but I recommend it to you. And there is much more, and there is much more to come. Amongst John's works in progress that relate to Montaigne are several books, as I said, one on Martin Guerre, another on free speech in Montaigne, and articles or chapters about the essay in Latin, unrecorded copies of the essay in libraries in the British Isles, the presence of Montaigne's essay at the Inns of Court, and much more. A final thing that I shall mention is a project on which John is collaborating with Marie-Luce de Monet. Together, they are producing an online edition of the Antwerp copy of the 1595 essay. And to that end, they are examining individual copies of the first posthumous Paris edition in order to register the variants. And thus far, they have examined individually, John tells me, between 80 and 90 copies, and their tabulation runs to 111 pages to date. This is a major and exciting undertaking, and one about which John will be telling us a little more in just a while. It is truly a delight and an honor to welcome John to the series today. Thank you so much, John, for joining us. Before we continue, a quick reminder that each episode of this series is divided into 3 parts. In a first moment, John will answer my Montaigne questionnaire. In a second moment, he will be talking to us about current work on Montaigne. And the third and final moment will be one of discussion with you who are joining us by Zoom. Please feel free to enter your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen at any point at all. I will be reading them out when we get to the third part of our episode. Et n'hésitez pas à rédiger vos questions en français, bien sûr. So, without further ado, it's time for the Montaigne questionnaire. So, John, my first question is the following, and I'm just going to unmute you.
I've unmuted myself.
Oh, there you go. Fantastic. So when, how, and why did you first read Montaigne's essay?
Well, first of all, Philip, thank you for an extraordinary, fulsome account of my work. Done with characteristic generosity and thoroughness. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to our session. I hadn't met Montaigne before I went to university. It was at university that I met Montaigne, and I was taught 16th century French literature by 3 remarkable women, of whom one is still alive, Jill Johndorf, she's still alive. And it was really at lectures by Dorothy Coleman that I encountered Montaigne. And I can remember how she started those lectures to this day. She made a comparison between Montaigne and Proust. Now, I hadn't read Montaigne up to then, but I had read Proust. I'd read the first volume of Proust, which I bought at the age of 17 in Paris. So this was extraordinarily exciting for me. Montaigne, like Proust, she argued, held that writing came from an autre moi, and then she explained the comparison, and that kind of undergirded her opening lecture, or more than an opening lecture, on Montaigne. And from that moment, I suppose I was hooked. I didn't do any special work on Montaigne particularly. I mean, I just did what was prescribed in the undergraduate curriculum. I think the next biggest kind of episode in my life was when I had to deliver a paper in front of at a conference in front of the people that had taught me. And I think that's quite a big moment in an academic's life when you have to do that. And I actually was talking about Montaigne then. And so, you know, I'm very grateful to those three who taught me. And I remember them not only fondly, but I remember their teaching with great profit.
Which of the chapters of the essay is the one that over the years you find yourself returning to? And maybe it's the same question, maybe not. Which is your favorite chapter?
Oh, right. Okay. I found this really hard. Let me first of all say that I'm privileged to belong to the Oxford Montaigne reading group, which meets a couple of times a term in order to read the essays in order. And we've read the first two books, and tomorrow we're starting the first chapter of book 3. So in that sense, my regular reading of chapters is taken care of. But that's not really the spirit of your question. You mean which chapters or parts of chapters have insistently returned over the course of the years. Well, I found this a very difficult one to deal with. So I'll explain a little bit about my kind of reading and thinking habits. The way in which I tend to read Montaigne is not by thinking, oh, I'll completely reread such and such a chapter. Sometimes I do that. But more often, I tend to be struck by moments or episodes or scenes. And so what I'm going to give you are a couple of moments and then a slightly longer scene, which really shows you the kind of way in which I approach our author. So the first one is this. 237 de la ressemblance des enfants au père. This is the moment when Montaigne wonders how a drop of water, that's what he calls it, a drop of water, he means semen, how it could result in stones, because this is where he tells us about the congenital affliction that he's got. So his question is, how can fluid solidify? And it's that becoming stony which fascinates me, and the effect that it has on his writing, especially in a chapter which is about the end in some sense. And 237 was the end of the essay in 1580. That's where they ended in 1580. Will that chapter be the end of him? And if it's not, and we know it isn't, there's a third book to come eventually, then what sort of human body is it that is slowly petrifying? In other words, I mean, turning to stone in that sense. And how do you listen to and record and reflect upon your own increasing stoniness? So that's what occurs to me when I read 237, a chapter of which I'm certainly very fond. It's a kind of that moment where he kind of makes us reflect on something about him and about ourselves. My second snippet is the last few sentences of Descartes, extremely famous. The Inca nobles struggle to hold their king aloft until a Spanish horseman pulls him to the ground. Now, the Renaissance, I mean, let's call it that for the time being. The Renaissance is sometimes thought of in terms of the nascent, the emergent, the coming into being, the coming into visibility. But in the essay, Montaigne not infrequently captures the opposite phenomenon, passing into oblivion, becoming a page in someone else's history. And this episode in 3.6 prompts perhaps an even more pointed reflection on how civilizational flourishing is related to, indeed perhaps even depends on, destruction. In order that the Renaissance can come into being, something else has to be extinguished. And that's what we kind of are witnessing at the end of 3.6. The same point is made implicitly at the end of De Cannibal. You know, there are the cannibals marooned in 16th century France, exhibited as New World exotica, but ultimately, you know, condemned to destruction. So it's really that kind of the opposite of coming into being. It's going out of being. It's going into extinction. And then finally, after those kind of two snippets, slightly longer one, there's a very awkward scene, a very awkward moment, really, in 3.12, de la physionomie, when Montaigne records Socrates as saying that his ugly face does indeed betoken a pli vicieux, a mean streak in his nature, but that he, Socrates, controls it either by the use of universal reason or by training, instruction. He gives two explanations from two classical sources. But clearly, this goes against the grain of the chapter, which is extolled at the outset, extolled Socrates' defense to his judges as being fully in harmony with nature. He speaks naturally. And that in turn leads to the final episode where Montaigne's natural open face speaks for him. So what's happening in this kind of strange, discordant moment? I think the key, at least to me, is when Montaigne says that Lavoisier was like Socrates, in other words, was ugly on the outside, but nevertheless, there was something else on the inside. Montaigne could have bridged that problem, that gap, by appealing to something like the Erasmian adage, the silences of Alcibiades, very well-known adage, of course, because of Rabelais, in which you get something that's ugly on the outside, which has something precious on the inside. But he doesn't do that. He doesn't do that. He allows the incongruity to stand. And I would say he allows it to stand as part of a point about defacement. Socrates is condemned to death by the 30 tyrants who ruled Athens because of his twisted character, betokened by his twisted features. Lavoisier's work is distorted, its features are disfigured, as Montaigne complains in chapter 128 by, I'm quoting Montaigne in French translation, by those who seek to disturb and change the state of our government. So for me, that crux in 312 fits in with the whole problem in the essay of physiognomics. Montaigne's effort to restore to Lavoisier une face d'homme, that's what he's trying to do. And then more broadly, the proximity of 312 to 311, which evokes, as you said earlier, Philip, the Martin Guerre case, where two distinct people can seem to occupy the same physiognomic and physical identity. So it's that really that kind of thinking in pairs, Lavoisier and Socrates, Arnaud Duty, Martin Guerre. It's that kind of, what is the strange relation between those pairs? And how does that kind of issue forth in a problem about faces and appearances and truth-telling and presentation and so on and so forth? So those are kind of really episodes from the way in which I tend to read the essays. My favorite one, well, I don't know about my absolute favorite one, but certainly a favorite one would have to be 3.9 de la Vanité, because it's so magnificently about emptiness. Off he goes on his travels, ends up in Rome, gets a bull from the Pope, and that bull, the bulle, is also a bubble, which is poppable and empty. And I think it so magnificently talks about, ends up by discussing or exemplifying the title of the chapter. That has to be, I think, one of my favorite. He's gone all that way for a bubble.
Beautiful. Why should we read Montaigne in 2024? And I note in the your introduction to Montaigne Outre-Manche that you comment how Montaigne is increasingly taught or studied in fewer and fewer institutions.
Yeah.
I don't know what that tells us or what we could do or should do about getting a wider audience. But yeah, should we be reading him?
Okay. Well, I think we should. And I'm going to put forward kind of 3 points really. About why we should. They're all interconnected, and you'll see that they're really kind of extrapolating and combining material that comes out of 3.1, 3.8, and 3.10. So the first, I'd say, first point is this: it's a point about amitié. What does it mean to live together in a civic bond? In other words, amitié as the foundation of the common weal, the public sense of the term friendship, sociability, the glue, the social glue that holds us together. Now, Montaigne is keenly aware of what it takes to constitute that bond. The rule of law, the observance of customs as a second law, the unity of the shared political will. But if anything, he's even more sharply aware of what threatens that bond. The threat to that bond is also a threat to my freedom and my sense of being human in such circumstances. So that's the first point. The second point, parole. In chapter 1.9, Montaigne says, we're human and hold together only by our word. And that idea of word as a bond, which is binding, but not a bondage, seems to me fundamental to Montaigne, because it involves, among other things, acts of communication, giving one's word, keeping one's word, as well as being the sort of reader who is able to understand un livre de bonne foi, a book written in good faith, as Frame translated. Now, Montaigne is very conscious, right from the word go, Montaigne is very conscious of the fragility of the human word as bond and communication, and in particular, when it comes to freedom of expression, freedom of speech. And he makes a distinction between freedom and license. For him, the act of speaking must involve an ethics of speaking. In other words, the act of speaking, particularly public speaking, is not the right to say publicly just anything at all in any way you choose. But in Montaigne's time, as in ours, that distinction and that ethical imperative were not well observed. He, like us, witnessed the instrumentalization of words for the purpose of whipping up unrest and discontent, with the result that feeling is substituted for reason. So feeling becomes a higher truth than reason. He, like us, witnessed the constant use of paradiastoly. And paradiastoly is the rhetorical trope of redescription. In other words, I'm not invading Ukraine, I'm conducting a special operation to wipe out Nazism. That's paradiastoly, the trope of redescription. Hence, Montaigne's emphasis on the critical importance of the judgment in order to filter out the false news, the disinformation, the lies used to influence public opinion, and me, therefore, because those deliberate distortions of parole erode the commonweal, destroy the trust that human beings must have in each other in order to exist together in a civil association. So that's my second point. My final point, freedom. There's a consequence for both of those things, amitié and parole, for the notion of freedom. License is not freedom, either in Montaigne's day or in ours. Licentious persons, by licentious persons, I use it in a very broad sense. I'm not referring to kind of sexual morals or anything like that. I'm using it in a very broad sense. Licentious persons do not belong to themselves. They belong to their passions, in the same way that slaves belong to someone else. Only the free belong to themselves. So how is it that I can belong to myself? Because to belong to myself is to be free, and part of Montaigne's purpose in the essay is to show how to be free in the midst of rhetorically and linguistically, as well as sometimes physically violent times. So I think that if Montaigne had known the dictum attributed to Jefferson, whether Jefferson said it or not, he would have approved of it. The price of freedom is eternal vigilance. I think Montaigne would have agreed with it. So those, Philip, those are three reasons. As I said before, you can see that I've kind of taken and blended together material from some of the chapters in book 3, with one or two other things thrown in. Those are three reasons, I think, why we would want to read Montaigne today.
Thank you, John. Fourth and final question, which is the article or book about Montaigne which you did not write that you most often recommend to students or colleagues or friends?
Okay, well, of course, there are many developed studies, many developed studies, and I'm not going to recommend them. If we're talking about a kind of student audience, for a non-student audience, that's a different matter. But for a student audience, there are two books. I'm going to mention two of them by two people who were friends, because I think they both made a step change in different ways. The first is Jean-Yves Pouilloux' Lire les Essais de Montaigne, which was actually mentioned in a previous program of this series. It's an old book now, but it was reprinted as the first part of Montaigne, L'éveil de l'esprit, in the early part of the 21st century. Now, one of the points Pouilloux makes is that the shape of the essay is intrinsic to their argument. And that shape can't be reduced to aphorisms, wisdom literature. It can't be reordered, as Charon tries to do in De la Sagesse. It can't be either of those things without losing the shape that Montaigne has set up. The essays create patterns of non-order rather than disorder through the interplay of three sets of discourses as Pouilloux sees it: affirmation, distinction, and dissolution. I'll briefly explain them. Affirmation, those occasions when Montaigne says or quotes, we always think, we always do, we always say. Distinction. Montaigne, at another level, says, well, do we always say that? You could say that we do the opposite. Well, it's not very clear. Here are lots of examples which don't run all in the same direction. Dissolution. Well, you're just listening to, the blatherings of le badin de la farce anyway. And what Pouillou does is to see those three discourses as constantly interacting in Montaigne's work, such that you can't reduce the essay to just a single linguistic entity. So you have a kind of pluralization, but he concentrates on the effects of discourse rather than portrait of a moi. It's not about portrait of moi, it's about the effects of discourse. That's it's a very 1970s, 80s thing to do, but he makes, I think, a really important point of those kind of interaction, interpenetration of different levels and of discourse in the essay and different types. And I think, at the time, certainly that made a step change. There's the second book, I would say, is Tournant's Montaigne en toutes lettres. If I hold it up, can you see it there? Can everybody see it or not? Not very well, I think. It looks like that anyway. Montaigne en toutes lettres. There it is. Anyway, back to front. It seems to me to introduce another step change. Tournant's central question is, what does the word essay mean? It's not the name of a chapter. It's not a genre. It's not a label. It's an activity or an operation, even sometimes a sort of energy. For Tournant, it's the exercise of the judgment under the banner of Pyrrhonian skepticism. Montaigne is for Tournant a skeptic in the sense of an inquirer, a perpetual inquirer who's constantly testing out propositions, ideas, opinions, and so forth. And his writing embodies both the inquiry, the investigation, and a process on the reflection, on the process of investigation. So Tournant doesn't deny that Montaigne writes about himself, but he places this initiative under the operation of essay. For Tournant, self-portrayal isn't the most essential thing about Montaigne's work. It's one of the modes in which it functions, in one of the ways in which Montaigne's work functions, subject to the touchstone of judgment within the ambit of writing. And all those things are important for Tournant. The touchstone of judgment, but with the ambit of writing. And Tournant's very good at analysing minutely how language works in the essay, particularly when it comes to discriminations of judgment. So those are two books that I recommend because they seem to me to make a real difference to our understanding of Montaigne. I'll just mention, you mentioned articles. Although now old, I still think that there is plenty of valuable material in Terence Cave's contribution to the posthumous Festschrift that came out for Richard Sayce, Problems of Reading It in the Essay. I think that has still got a lot going for it. I find that a very rich essay. And the one that adjoins it in that volume by Ian MacLean on Montaigne and philosophical speculation is also, I think, they're both very beautifully crisp, but also rich encapsulations of their particular topics. So if I was recommending people to read something, those are things I'd read. Let me very quickly, Philip, take up the question that you asked me about, Montaigne getting taught kind of less and less, or in particular institutions. I think that Montaigne comes out of this situation quite well. There's clearly a lot of public interest in Montaigne, as you can see from the huge success of Sarah Bakewell, for example, and Compagnons d'un été avec Montaigne, which I myself didn't particularly like, but sold fantastically well and clearly appealed to a public. There's clearly an interest in Montaigne out there, and it's not confined to academic circles. I'd say within academic circles, worldwide, probably Montaigne is the 16th century author, along with Rabelais, but along with Marguerite Navarre, women's literature as well, which still survives and is taught fairly extensively in universities. It's probably the rest of the 16th century universe which hasn't fared so well, and that's probably true. Depends on the country. Not in France, but outside France, probably poetry fares less well than prose, I would say. So those are my answers, Philip, to your question.
Thank you, John. Lots to go read. It's now time for me to hand over the microphone without a question to John,
Right.
who will be telling us about a really interesting project that you're involved with. So yeah, over to you. And you're going to share your screen, I think.
Okay, I am. Yeah. Share screen. Share.
Perfect. Yep.
Can you see that?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. Participants can now see your application. Okay. Well, Philip very kindly mentioned this project earlier, and I won't add very much more than that. It's a project which is still ongoing. And to talk about the essays of 1595 and their variants does sound pretty dry, even by my standards. But fear not, I'm not going to show you lots of pictures of commas, though I will show you some pictures of some. What I'm going to do is going to be fairly informal. I'm not going to talk to a script. I'm going to talk to various slides. And what I want to do is to look at the findings that we've got so far, the findings that Marie-Luce and I have got with so far, through the prism of friendship. So here's the first thing that I want to look at. What's that not? Here we go. Right, here we go. This is from Le Poumon Noir de Monsieur de Montaigne, 1588, as we know. And this is Gournay's letter preface to Montaigne. And it ends like this. She says, Mon père, addressing Montaigne, Mon père, recevez ici l'adieu d'autre fille glorifiée et béatifiée de ce titre. And then there are two lines in Latin. And then where it's the 26th of November, 1588, from Gournay, the castle in Picardy. Now, those two lines are these here. I'm not going to read them in Latin. I'll just read them in English translation. And I do not fear that your descendants will refuse, if fate allows it, to insert our names among those of renowned friends. These lines are by La Boétie, a Latin poem by La Boétie, addressed to Montaigne. And what Gournay is therefore doing is inserting herself, using those lines, inserting herself alongside La Boétie, or maybe even instead of La Boétie, in relationship to Montaigne. And she does so in two ways. One, a kind of social way, a family way, Mon père recevait ici, and the other, a literary way, by quoting those lines by C. Now, if you haven't yet read or dipped into Neil Kenny's book, Born to Write, you should, because that's about social standing, social status of families of writers. And these are biological families. What's interesting about this case, La Boétie, Gournay, and Montaigne, is that they're non-biological, but two of the three people, La Boétie himself and Gournay, were orphans. La Boétie was brought up by his uncle, confusingly also called Etienne. And Gournay, of course, felt so acutely the loss that she puts Montaigne in the place of her father and constantly calls him Mon père. So you've got a kind of reconfiguration of a biological family of writers, non-biological, but nevertheless a family. And Gournay is, in 1588, placing herself within that family, within that relationship by this means. If we now move on, let's move on to the 1595. This is a snippet from chapter 2.8 in 1595, in which Montaigne says, this is the 1595 text. Car, comme je sais par une trop certaine expérience, il n'est aucune si douce consolation la perte de nos amis que celle que nous apporte la science de n'avoir rien oublié à leur dire et d'avoir eu avec eux une parfaite et entière communication. Oh, mon ami, en vaut-je mieux d'en avoir le goût, ou si j'en vaux moins. J'en vaux certes bien mieux. Now, that, strangely enough, that snippet in which clearly, Montaigne is evoking La Boétie with the introduction, or mon ami. This is where it comes in on the exemplaire de Bordeaux. Here is where we are. We're right down here, if you can see if my cursor is working. It's right down here, but there's no insert mark. This is the passage that I've just read to you, and it's all been crossed out. If I just go there, you can see, it says, en vaut-je mieux d'en avoir le goût, but you see that there's no interjection. Oh, mon ami, that's not there at all. It originally came much further up the page and was related to an entirely different point. Here, it has been placed further down the page, and the interjection, the exclamation, has been added to it. And what's interesting about this is that in some copies, that interjection doesn't exist. And what we get is, car comme je sais, par une trop certaine expérience, il n'y a aucune si douce consolation en la perte de nos amis, que celle que nous apporte la science de n'avoir rien oublié à leur dire, et d'avoir eu avec eux une parfaite et entière communication d'un ami. Point. En vaut-je mieux, etc., etc. Of the copies that we've looked at, most still contain communication d'un ami. Jean Séard said to us and said publicly that he doesn't think that sentence has any sense. D'avoir eu avec eux une parfaite et entière communication d'un ami. That doesn't make sense. There must have been some mistakes being made, and he thinks, and Marie-Luce thinks, that, go back here, that what was left out was oh mon ami. It's introduced in some of the copies, I think about 34 copies have oh mon ami, about 44 copies have communication d'un ami. And what's interesting about it, as Marie-Luce says, is that it's possible to think of this also not simply as Montaigne addressing La Boétie, but posthumously Marie de Gournay addressing Montaigne. Oh mon ami, en vaut-je mieux d'en avoir le goût, and so on and so forth. So there's a kind of ventriloquization of Montaigne's words by Gournay in the same way that she's ventriloquized La Boétie's words in 1588. I think it's quite a nice point, the way in which, according to Marie-Luce, the article she wrote about it, I should say, is in the mélange of Ulrich Langer called Éloge du Singulier. And her article is chapter very near the beginning. It's called Recherche d'un coupable, but it could be d'une coupable. She writes UN brackets, E brackets, Recherche d'un coupable. Or d'une. I think it's a nice idea that, in fact, this is the correct version, or mon ami. The other isn't the correct version. It doesn't really make proper sense at the end. And once again, here we have Gournay talking about friendship and putting herself alongside the person that she called father. I'm going to move now to the end of 217. Here's 217 in the 1595 version. J'ai pris plaisir à publier en plusieurs lieux l'espérance que j'ai de Marie de Gournay le genre, ma fille d'alliance. Et certes, aimée de moi beaucoup plus que paternellement, et enveloppée en ma retraite et solitude, comme l'une des meilleures parties de mon propre être. Je ne regarde plus qu'elle au monde. Si l'adolescence peut donner présage, cette âme sera quelque jour capable des plus belles choses, et entre autres de la perfection de cette très sainte amitié où nous ne lisons point que son sexe ait pu monter encore. La sincérité et la solidité de ses mœurs y sont déjà battantes, son affection vers moi plus que surabondante, et telle en somme qu'il n'y a rien à souhaiter, sinon l'appréhension qu'elle a de ma fin par les 55 ans auxquels elle m'a rencontré, la travailla moins cruellement. Le jugement qu'elle fit des premiers essais, et femme, et en ce siècle, et si jeune, et seule en son quartier, et la véhémence fameuse dont elle m'aima et me désira longtemps sur la seule estime qu'elle emprunte de moi, avant de m'avoir vu, c'est un accident de très digne considération. Les autres vertus ont eu peu ou point de mise en cet âge, mais la vaillance incessante. Now, that's 1595, and we know that Gournay read and seems to have approved that because this is Antwerp 1. This is therefore the copy that Philip referred to before, a copy that was sent by Gournay almost certainly to Plantin. That's where it still is. It's in the Plantin Mauritius Museum in Antwerp. If you've never been there, I heartily recommend you go. This is it, page 439, and you can see that she makes a correction there. Instead of it being battante, which doesn't really make much sense, she puts bastante, sufficient, adequate from the Italian. So we know that she read it. In 1595, she's writing that, and she makes one correction, but she doesn't do anything else. Now, let's move on. That isn't there, that particular passage isn't there in the Exemplaire de Bordeaux. Here is the appropriate page of the Exemplaire de Bordeaux. There seems to be an insertion mark here. There's an insertion mark here towards the top of the page. There's a passage here which is to be inserted. But the passage that I've just read j'ai pris plaisir, isn't there. It's not there at all. There might have been something here. You can see there's a discolored patch here. And it's led people to speculate that maybe there were kind of pieces of paper stuck in which have subsequently fallen out. I believe that Philip Dezan has actually examined that page, and he says there's no trace of glue that he can see. So it wasn't there in 1590 in the Exemplaire de Bordeaux. It's there in 1595. And it's just one of the ways in which we know that the Exemplaire de Bordeaux and the copy from which Gournay established the 1595 text were not kind of identical. It's not uncommon, incidentally, for there to be passages which are not there on the Exemplaire de Bordeaux, but are there in 1595. And we saw a previous example where a passage had been crossed out reappears in 1595. So it's not there in 1595. Other people then speculated, well, maybe Gournay put it there herself. I don't think that's particularly likely. I myself don't hold to that. But that has been one of the speculations. Now, in my travels around looking at copies of Montaigne unrecorded, I came to Maynooth in Ireland. And here is the copy of 1595 they had. It's not the most beautiful copy of Montaigne at all. This is a late 19th or early 20th century binding. It's not very attractive, but you know, rather like Lavoisier and Socrates, as we saw earlier, it does hold treasures. Because if we turn to the same page at the very end of 217, we've got this. And this is Gournay's writing. This is the blown up version. This is Gournay's writing. You see that it's been trimmed at the edge rather irritatingly. So I've had to supply words. And you can see that at some point, she's crossed out and rewritten a lot of that particular éloge of her, which she allowed to stand in 1595. So if I then transcribe this, so no transcription, it looks like this. And you can see that most of it has been crossed out. Some of it has been allowed to stand, and some of it has been rewritten. The letters in brackets are those that I've supplied because they've been trimmed at some stage. When it's been rebound, it's been trimmed. So if we take that just as it is and boil it down, what do we get? We've got this. Les autres vertus ont eu peu au point de mise en cet âge, mais la variance, etc., etc., etc. J'ai pris plaisir à publier en plusieurs lieux l'espérance que j'ai de Marie de Gournay-le-Jarre, ma fille d'alliance, et certes aimée de moi plus que paternellement. Si l'adolescence peut donner présage, cette âme sera quelque jour capable des plus belles choses. Le jugement que fit des premiers essais, et femme, et 11 siècles, et si jeune, et seule en son quartier, et la bienveillance qu'elle me voit, sur la seule estime qu'elle emprunte de moi, longtemps avant qu'elle m'ait vu, sont des accidents de très digne considération. Voilà tout ce que j'ai connu. So, of that very long passage, which stood in 1595, all we've got left is that. If we go to the text of 1617, in the text of 1617, we've still got the passage as it appears in 1595. Here we are. J'ai pris plaisir à publier en plusieurs lieux, je ne regarde plus qu'elle au monde, and la sincérité sur les mœurs, le jugement qu'elle fait. It's exactly the same. In 1617, Gournay comes back to the essays. She puts back the preface of the essay, and the format changes it. While it continues to be in octavo, now this particular edition is in quarto. And that quarto edition continues in 1625. And this is where we've got the change. Les autres vertus ont eu peu au point de mise en cet âge, j'ai pris plaisir à publier en plusieurs lieux, l'espérance que j'ai, and there you've got the text in 1625 of that passage there. It's the same text. So we know that that this copy of the essay that I found in Maynooth must have been altered in or around 1625, and we actually know a little bit more about it. She says in the preface to the 1625 edition, en ce seul point, et j'ai été hardi de retrancher quelque chose d'un passage qui me regarde, à l'exemple de celui qui mit sa belle maison par terre, afin d'y mettre avec elle l'envie qu'on leur emportait. Joint que je veux démentir maintenant, et pour l'avenir, si Dieu prolonge mes années, ceux qui croient que si ce livre me louait moins, je le chérirai et servirai moi aussi. So that's where she's telling us what she's done to that passage. And that copy of the 1595 essays in Maynooth must be from around this same time, 1625. She's cut it down. In 1635, she leaves the same passage. You can see there, that's the end of that's the 1635 version. Except you can see I put two blue lines there. She changes certes aimé de moi plus que paternellement. She just changes that to paternellement. Plus que paternellement has disappeared, and we've just got aimé de moi paternellement. Now, we know some other things about this volume because she puts a handwritten dedication in it. The recipient was a man called Henri de Berringen. He was the son of a very staunch Protestant supporter of Henri IV. His aunt, Marie Desloges, ran a salon that Gournay attended in the 1620s, where she would have met Malherbe, Voiture, Godot, and so forth. And Marie Desloges was the dedicatee of Gournay's Défense de la poésie et du langage des poètes, published in L'Ombre de la Demoiselle de Gournay in 1626, reprinted in 1634 and 41. So in or around 25, she's giving a present, she calls it a présent, to the nephew, Henri de Berringen. She gives what is in fact a second-hand copy of the essay. And the following year, she dedicates her Défense de la poésie et du langage des poètes to the aunt whose salon she attended. And clearly what's happening here, now we've seen, we've gone back from 1588 through 1595 and now to 1625. And those social conditions, social and intellectual conditions that Gournay is writing in now change. She wants to own some of that description, from 1595, but she doesn't want to own all of it. She does want to own the part which talks about her as about her acumen in dealing with the essay. She doesn't want to own the part about where Montaigne talks about her, je ne vois plus qu'elle au monde and so forth. She doesn't want to own that. She gets rid of that. She herself is an established writer, and she's meeting other writers in this salon. So what we have here is a very good example of something that Neil talks about in his book. This emergence within social conditions, within particular social conditions of writers, families of writers, often in his book. In this case, one particular writer, Gournay, and in the same way that she grafts her way into Montaigne's family through the notion of père, through the notion of amitié by quoting La Boétie. So now she's willing to take a kind of critical distance, accept some of what that description is offering her, and not the rest. Now that she herself is she's her own person, she's her own writer, and we can see kind of, if you like, the part of the emergence of Gournay as a writer within that world, 1625, 1588, 1595, 1625. We can see that whole cursus that she's actually followed, and the editions, the copies of the essays, particularly the main news one, allow us to trace that in a particular kind of potent way. So that is what I wanted to say.
That's amazing, John. Thank you. It's what's sleuthing?
Yes, I mean, some of it, Philip, have to say, is it's kind of happenstance. Sometimes it works and sometimes it didn't, and in this case, it really did work.
Wow. And it really, I mean, on the one hand, what's sleuthing, and apparently a little bit of luck, but also, I mean, it really changes the story we can tell about Marie de Gournay.
Yeah, it does, and about how she emerges as a writer with and around and also beyond the essay of Montaigne. Because she's continuing to do this work on the essay, but now she has her own critical judgment, and she has her own view of what she wants to own and what she doesn't want to own.
Wow. How does this fit with what we know of Montaigne in the 17th century in terms of what impact this would have, her sort of standing back?
Yeah. Okay. Well, the 17th century question has been bedeviled really by the fact that Montaigne tends to get sucked into either the ambit of Pascal or the ambit of kind of libertinage and things like that, and tend to become sucked in there. If you stand back and look at kind of more ordinary readers are really interested in Montaigne for what he can kind of illuminate about their particular situation. And he's often used in the 17th century as among ordinary readers, not those kind of polemical readers, but among ordinary readers, he's read by kind of gentlemen, he's read by bishops, and so forth. And they see him in him the reflection of their own status, dealing with problems that they have to deal with. So, he is sometimes referred to in philosophical terms as our French Seneca, our Gallic Seneca, and so forth. But there are also lots of other readers in France and in Europe, particularly, who are not part of that Gallic context and use him for kind of different purposes. So he has his own defined trajectory. And that's quite a big one. I mean, it forges right across Europe. And there's a lot of that story which still hasn't been told, unfortunately. We know we tended to stick to the kind of Gallic bit, or we've come to England a bit, but there's a lot more to it than that. He becomes really, in the 17th century, a writer of European significance.
Not to ask an overly detailed question, do we know
Sure.
how the how the Maynooth copy got to Maynooth?
Yes, we do. As you will have already guessed, Philip, um, it came from abroad. It came from the Irish college, one of the Irish colleges in Portugal,
Oh,
not Lisbon, but somewhere else. Was it a Porto? I forget where it was, Philip. I do know, but I was told, but I've forgotten. When that was closed, they basically sold off the books. This happened elsewhere too. This happened
mm,
elsewhere too. When it's closed, they sold off the books, and Maynooth managed to get hold of a slice of the books.
wow.
And that's where lots of their early books in their library, which was built for them by Pugin. Many of those early books have got Portuguese signatures and belongs to the convent of whatever it is in Portugal. They have a lot of there's Portuguese ownership there. That's where they come
Mm,
from. How it got to the Irish College in Portugal, I have absolutely no idea. But it was common in colleges of that kind to buy, the most famous books of the most famous writers.
mm,
And so they would have these libraries of books that they actually they almost were bought them by the meter almost. Um, so there we are.
wow. I'm really struck and have always really appreciated in your work the emphasis on quote unquote ordinary readers, right? People who
Yes,
aren't famous for any particular reason or
yes.
whom we don't really speak. Is it different for you reading or looking at what Marie de Gournay did and her sort of her part of the puzzle versus quote unquote ordinary readers?
Yes, I mean it tends to be different if the readers are themselves writers,
Mm,
and where they themselves are writers, they're looking at Montaigne. They're not looking for a moi or something like that, but they're looking for the way in which he kind of develops the material, in which he thinks about material, and they often pick up on the oddness of his approach. They'll say, well, sometimes for better or for worse, actually, they'll say, well, it seems very fantastical.
mm,
Some of them, these ordinary readers, some of them say, yeah, it's fantastical, but actually he makes a really good point by thinking in this rather strange way. So
mm,
some of them, not all of them, some of them do pick up on the fact that the non-order of the essays and the quirkiness of the essays are making points that you couldn't make simply by a series of logical statements. They do
mm,
pick up on
mm,
that. Whether they reflect that in their own writing is a different point.
mm.
It's not necessarily so, but they do appreciate that here is somebody who thinks in particular patterns, and those patterns are unusual patterns, but those patterns allow access um, to kind of areas which otherwise would not be, so easily accessed.
Mm, mm. So what is the online edition of this going to look like?
Mm.
When do we
Yeah.
get to see it?
Well, yeah, that's a good point, Philip. Well, Marie-Luce and I don't think we quite decided yet. I mean, I should say that it's
Mm,
really Marie-Luce's, it was really Marie-Luce's project. I came into it kind of a bit later,
mhm,
agreeing to put all the stuff in kind of English-speaking countries and elsewhere too. Um, there'll be a kind of resume of it, which will probably come in article form.
mhm,
Probably we'll publish that in BHR.
mhm,
Um, the online thing, how are we going to condense what is now 111 pages? If you put it online, you don't need to condense that much, really.
mhm,
You can pretty well put it there, but it needs to be clear as to what we're doing. And
mm,
the problem is always going to be having a very cluttered text.
mm,
You don't want the text to be cluttered. We do have how we're going to deal with this. I don't quite know. We do have kind of two guidelines because what's happened what's interesting is that the Maynooth copy of the essay has not quite as many, but many of the significant extra corrections that Gournay puts into the Antwerp version. So we have a kind of double way of saying, well, is this really a variant that we should be paying any attention to? If it's in Antwerp and it's in Maynooth, we can be sure that there was supposed to be there's supposed to be a kind of variant there. How we're going to do with it, I don't know, without it becoming cumbersome. But there is just a remarkable amount of evidence which we've thrown up that nobody's thrown up before. I mean, I should say, to be fair, that this particular project was first undertaken by Richard Sayce in the 1970s. He looked at about 20 copies and had oversight of 20 more. We've now done between 80 and 90, and we've had, really, we've had quite an astonishing time because we've been able to go to auction houses, and very upscale booksellers in Paris, and they put all these copies at our disposal. We've seen a much greater range of copies, some incomplete, than Sayce ever could. And so, the evidence that we've been able to put together is much more comprehensive, we hope. We can't hope to see all the copies, but we can hope to see as many as possible.
Is there one particular copy or hypothetical copy that you would love to find?
Well, I think we'd all love to find if it still exists, which probably it doesn't, the copy from which Gournay established the text of the 1595, because that would be quite extraordinary to find that. I think these things were, when they've been used for being typeset, they're often just kind of thrown away. It'd be nice to think that it was kind of lurking somewhere where we could get hold of it and then just compare it with the Exemplaire de Bordeaux. The Exemplaire de Bordeaux, of course, is an incomparable treasure. It truly is a treasure, but it's a treasure which has some limitations, and we need to be able to compare other evidence, but the other evidence is not there. There's a blank between the Exemplaire de Bordeaux and 1595. There's a blank, and we can hypothesize what was in the blank, but we haven't yet got anything to fill it. That's what we need to find.
Maybe there's a chest somewhere in someone's attic. It's yeah.
Well, you can never quite tell what there is in Central and Eastern Europe, because that's never really been properly investigated. Another possibility is Italy. There is so far, if you can believe it, one copy of 1595 in Italy. Well, that's just not possible. It's just not possible for there just to be one. There must be others, but they've not been catalogued. I mean, they're in Italian library somewhere, maybe in private libraries or in private hands. They've just not been catalogued. And of course, so the Central and Eastern Europe, which very badly catalogued. There's Italy, that's not properly catalogued either. And the other dimension is we just don't know how much remains in private hands. Unless people actually declare, well, I have a copy that you might like to see, which generally they don't, then we're, unlikely to see it, except if it comes up for auction, or, comes up on the market in some other way. So there's still big blanks in our knowledge, but we're in an incomparably better position now than Sayce was in the 1970s, and therefore the text of Montaigne and understanding how it evolved and what people thought, what the contemporary editor Gournay thought were important readings, there our knowledge has really come on in leaps and bounds.
I'm always in conversations like this, just always reminded how fragile the history of literature is, right? It's hanging by a thread by,
Yes,
a couple of people going to libraries around the world trying to put the picture together 500 years later, even though this is supposedly a canonical author. It's just
yes,
incredible.
yeah, that's true. Yes, and remember, Montaigne himself says, that things in contemporary France are hanging by a nail, meaning un
Mm.
clou, not un clou. It is extraordinary how much does hang by a nail. You're right.
Mm.
Yeah.
So we have a question from someone you know well, Luke O'Sullivan,
Oh,
who
right.
says,
Hello, Luke.
thank you, John. Do you think it is salient that Marie de Gournay gives this copy with such a seemingly significant edit? It is a peculiar odd example of a used book?
Yes. Thank you. Yes, it's clearly significant that she attends Marie Desloches' salon, and
Mm,
she presents something to of her own writing, and then in parallel with that, she presents something to the nephew. It's yeah, I mean the question about used book, Luke. One of the things that I should have consulted Ian McLean about this because he would have told me this sooner than I found out myself. People often, when they wanted to make gifts to people, they actually found it quite difficult getting hold of a copy of whatever work it was. And this work is clearly kind of, it's clearly used, clearly secondhand. Um, and um, we can see that right at the very beginning because somebody earlier from the 16th century started to annotate it, and Gournay's gone through and crossed out all the annotations. And she's changed things. She's put a different preface in, and she says to Henri de Berrigan, "I put a different preface in that because the old one was missing." And what she's putting in, what she's really doing, is kind of actualize, a kind of actualisation. I think that's what's happening, Lou. She's using a second-hand copy in order to actualize Montaigne within those circumstances, those very particular circumstances which he's now
mm,
on. It's not a particularly unusual use of a used book. You do find other example, but there isn't any other. Can I say that with impunity? I think I can say with impunity. There's no other copy of the 1595 essays that I know of where Gournay has made an excision and rearrangement and rewriting of that kind. It's
mm,
unique. It's unique from that point of view.
mm. Luke has a follow-up question, but I think you might have just answered it. Do you
Oh,
think there might be multiple copies with this edit? I'm thinking of the multiple copies where Montaigne changes the date of the Olicta, for instance.
could well be. It would be interesting to see, wouldn't it? It would be really interesting to see whether that edit, which is the edit of the 1625, and we don't know which way round it came. I mean, did she did she edit it on that copy of 1595 and then also do the edit for 1625, or had she done the edit of 1625, but then around the same time did the edit for the 1595? Difficult
Mm,
to say.
mm.
Um, but it's not inconceivable.
Thank you so much, John. This has been absolutely fantastic. Thank you for sharing the scoop with us.
Okay,
It's really, I was on the edge of my seat.
thank you very much. It's really kind of you to host me. It's been a pleasure being here. I hope I haven't been too technical. I did promise not to show endless commas, but there were some commas there nonetheless. And I really hope that it's not just about the text of Montaigne, but it's
Mm,
about you know what happens in particular copies and how they can actually alter our understanding of more than just Montaigne.
mm. Thank you so much, John.
Okay,
It's been a joy. Thank you to everybody who's joined us today by Zoom. And so let me close up here. So this is the final episode of conversations with people who read Montaigne for the spring semester. We'll be back in the fall with a number of new guests. I'm currently finalizing dates and details, but all will be revealed in due course at montaigne.us. All episodes of this series are available online, and you can consult them as well as accompanying materials such as summaries and bibliographical references by going to that same website, montaigne.us. It remains for me to thank the Maison Française, especially François Nudelman and Courtney Rutherford, the Department of French Literature, Thought and Culture, and its chair, Emily Apter, and NYU's Medieval and Renaissance Center and its director, Martha Rust. And especially thank you, everyone, for joining us, and thank you, John, so much
A pleasure.
for giving us your time and for sharing this scoop. It's really fascinating. We can't wait for it to be available. Have a good summer, everybody, and see you in the fall.